Al. Goeiemôre almal, julle is saam met ons by Handelinge 1:8 en dit is vandag weer my voorreg om 'n ongelooflike gas by ons te hê, twee gaste en ook die Afrikaanse Baptiste Kerk wat hierdie apologetiese geleentheid saam met ons of apologetieke geleentheid saam met ons bywoon. En so ek wil net vir julle sê, brace julle self, want saam met ons vandag is Simon Bruis van, as ek dit reg het, Christie internasionaal. Ek gaan dat hy homself voorstel wat hy doen en dan gaan hy somme inspring in die storie. Ek hoop julle gaan dit geniet en ek hoop dit kry julle aan die dink en ek hoop ons kan saam Jesus Christus soek vir wie hy is, nie vir wat hy vir ons vir wat hy vir ons kan doen nie, maar dat ons nader in 'n persoonlike verhouding met hom kan leef en meer mense van hom vertel uit 'n plek van autoriteit dat hy die weg, die waarheid en die lewe is. Dis hy Simon, oor na jou.
Baie dankie Reinier. Now, as you will hear from my accent, I am not Afrikaans, although I kind of qualify to some extent amongst my Afrikaans brothers and sisters in Christ because I did marry an Afrikaans girl and I do live in Potchefstroom now, so ek kan Afrikaans beter verstaan as wat ek kan praat. So my talk is going to be in English, but if you do have questions and you want to formulate them in Afrikaans, that's fine. We can do that as well in the Q&A session. And if you're looking for clarification because I'm using certain terms, feel free to ask a question as well. I see we don't have a huge audience, so I could even, if you need to put on your microphone, I'm not speaking to over 100 people here, which becomes a bit of a nightmare to manage, but we've got a fairly small crew, which I much prefer because we can actually be much more thorough in our discussions. Jesus only took 12 people, and so I'm all into small group training is always far more effective than massive crowds. So I'm quite excited about this opportunity this morning. I know that you've met Karnu. He's one of my colleagues who works with me at Christie. Christie is a student campus ministry, which seeks to help Christians on campus better understand the Christian faith and to provide and examine the historical, philosophical, scientific, and theological arguments and reasons for the Christian faith. Our goal is, first of all, to train and equip believers to better understand what they believe and why they believe it, and then to move beyond that to try and understand the crazy world in which we find ourselves by teaching stuff like worldviews and philosophy and just about everything under the sun, so that we can engage people around us, as Reinier said, not just with good conversation, but with the good news. We like good conversation. We want to live in a place where we can talk to our neighbors, but as Christians, we have a very important message for them all, the message from Jesus our Lord. And so we want to engage with them as well, effectively as we can. And in our age of skepticism and worldviews and questions, we've really got to do our homework now as Christians in order to prepare ourselves to represent Jesus as ambassadors, to understand and be able to give a reason for the hope that was within us. So 1 Peter 3:15 is a mandate, and to let our conversations be seasoned with salt. Our conversations need to be full of flavor, but also they need to be thoughtful and gracious. We need to understand the times we live in. That's our mandate from Jesus. That's how we can engage the world, and hopefully God might send us some to disciple, as we're being discipled by him, so we might disciple others. So that's the program. And today we're going to be examining the question of the existence of God. Last week we dealt, or the last time Karnu spoke with you, he dealt with the historical Jesus. I want to let you know as well that a lot of the stuff that we present to you, for people who are new to apologetics, and this feels like you're drinking from a fire hydrant. So there's just a rush. It's like standing at Victoria Falls with your mouth open at the bottom, and there's so much pouring down there, you only get a mouthful. So I don't want you to stress out about that. We want the content to be thick. We want to give you a sense of how powerful and how compelling these arguments are. But do note that we do have our website where we have a lot of articles for you to go and read, to go over some of these things and even go into greater depth. at all kinds of levels. We have recommended reading lists. We also have a YouTube channel with nearly 100 interviews from scholars all over the world. Russia, Christie, South Africa. You can go onto YouTube, and you can also go and look at a lot of our recordings there with scholars from around the world on all kinds of topics. Our project this evening, but this morning, is to examine the question of the existence of God, because when Cardinal taught with you guys last time, you addressed the historical Jesus. And so for most Christians, you kind of want to begin there, because if you're a believer, you have a regard for the Word of God. But of course, there are a lot of typical popular objections. How do we know that this is true, and why should we trust this? And hasn't this been handed down over centuries, like the telephone game, and it's got all corrupted? And did Jesus really exist? And these kinds of things. And so it's important for us to understand the historical aspect and case of Christianity. And we might tie us back into that, come full circle towards the end of my talk. But of course, at the center of this historical event is this thing called the resurrection. And the resurrection is a supernatural event. As Christians, we believe in a supernatural. We are supernaturalists. We believe that the cosmos is not all there is, that there is one who is behind the cosmos. We're not deists, and we don't believe that God just created the world and kind of leaves it to kind of do its own thing, that he, upon his own will and volition, decides when he wants to intervene in his world, and can intervene in the world, and can supersede or rise above the laws of nature, which he created to do supernatural things. Okay, and so when we're speaking to a lot of people about the Christian faith, if you've proceeded to make a compelling case for the historical Jesus and the historicity of the faith, well, that's one thing. Of course, we're always going to have to jump this hurdle over the question over, are miracles possible? Okay, because of course, you're then going to have to discuss the question of God, because of course, in order for you to have a supernatural event, you need a supernatural being, and you need God in order to do things like a resurrection. Okay, so at some level in the Christian faith, to some people, they can move from the historical case. They don't have such a big issue with this. But a lot of people nowadays, in our age of skepticism, might grant that there's historical merit to the Christian faith. But when it comes to the supernatural stuff, they really, really struggle with that. Okay, and so what we can do is we can examine the various arguments that exist, compelling arguments, in my estimation, for the existence of God. Now, there are many arguments for the existence of God, and we are only going to examine a few this morning. But hopefully I'll do a good enough job at a decent level for you to grasp some of these arguments. And if it gets a little bit into the deeper waters, then we've got Mike here, who's an expert in some of these arguments, and he can give us a hand. So let me go to sharing screen now. That's my kind of intro. I want to just do this here. I want to just get the right thing here. I'm going to go to, here. I know Karen taught me how to do this now, but I wanted to do the advanced share screen portion of screen. Tell me what you guys are seeing now.
We're seeing a part of, it's just, okay, we're seeing a part of the slide.
Okay. And how does that look now?
All right, that looks perfect. That's full screen.
Okay, so you got a picture there of a grumpy looking guy with the beard.
That's correct. That's correct.
Yes,
It's a bit blurry. I don't know why.
That might just be the quality of the picture. But anyway,
Okay.
if as long as you can kind of see that there, that's fine. That's the PowerPoint. I'm doing a presenter view here, so I've got my notes on the side here, which I'm going to look at now. Okay. So here we go then. Okay, so this is a quote here from Sigmund Freud, and as you can see, hang on a sec. His quote there is, religion is an illusion, okay? And so this is a popular kind of attitude that we come across in our culture today towards Christianity. Sigmund Freud, like many other European skeptics, shared this view regarding religion. Karl Marx had the same attitude towards religion, as did many other European secularists in the 1800s. Interestingly enough, this view comes from a Christian scholar by the name of Ludwig Feuerbach, who in his book Essence of Christianity talks about religion being a kind of psychological projection. And so this is what he took to be in psychology in the 1800s. And this view is maintained by many today, that religion is a kind of superstitious act on the part of individuals to kind of help them cope with the world. Okay, and so if you're a real serious thinker and atheist, then you don't need to traffic in superstition, and you just bite the bullet and say, well, there is no such thing as God or gods or souls. We just have the universe, and science explains everything. And so religion, well, we understand why religious people do this, but it's a psychological thing, okay? So this is a popular attitude, okay? All right, so we need to be kind of, we need to deal with this now, okay? But unfortunately, when it comes to dealing with this attitude, a lot of Christians fall down because they are unable to provide reasons for the Christian faith, okay? Even if you just kind of believe God and you didn't have a whole slew of reasons for it, that doesn't mean that your belief in God is false, okay? Because the question of the existence of God can be separated from how any one individual might have arrived at their conclusion, okay? You could arrive at that conclusion in a very irrational way, but if the conclusion is sound, then it's sound for everybody, irrespective. And so this is a popular objection. It's tied into what is called the genetic fallacy that is then leveled at Christians. So as Christians, you might have arrived and become a believer in a variety of ways, perhaps through a lot of subjective experience and personal experience. That's fine. Or you might have listened to some compelling Christian speakers and heard the arguments and been persuaded. But we want to be able to show as Christians that faith and reason are not at odds with one another, okay? That your faith is very much tied into the truth and the rationality of the existence of God and the universe and the created order, okay? And so as you grow as a believer, sometimes as you begin to study these things, we can begin to respond to these kinds of skeptics, because we can say that, no, I don't think that religion is just a psychological projection. Whilst I grant that there's aspects to the faith that deal with us on a subjective level, there are also compelling reasons to believe that Christianity is true. And last time with Cardinal, you looked at some of the historical reasons. We can look at that. That's one aspect. But we can look at other compelling reasons for why we should say believing in the existence of God is most reasonable. All right. Okay, so we need to deal with this now. Now, when you get into this, I'm just going to move this up and expand this up, because when you get to 50 years old, you're there we go. So unfortunately, a lot of Christians, when it comes to the definition of faith, they kind of would agree with what's being said here, that faith is belief in spite of, or perhaps even because of, the lack of evidence, okay? Well, this is actually a quote from Richard Dawkins, who's certainly no believer. This is a modern day atheist. He's very popular. He's written a lot of books like The God Delusion. And this is what a lot of skeptics think faith is. They look at many Christians and say faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Okay, now a lot of Christians, unfortunately, think that that's exactly what faith is. Well, that is not a biblical view of faith, okay? Just because you don't have any reasons doesn't mean there aren't any reasons, okay? And biblical faith is tied to the facts and the truths of the existence of God, okay? And we're going to see that as we look at some of these arguments. So we move beyond my own subjective experience with respect to Christianity. And we certainly do experience that. The conviction of your sin, for example, is very much a subjective encounter. But there's more to Christianity than just personal conviction of sin. There is the historical aspects of the Christian faith. There are the questions we can ask related to science and philosophy regarding faith, morality, and we're going to look at some of those now. Okay, here's Richard Dawkins.
When you say faith is rational and evidence-based, I mean, if that were true, it wouldn't need to be faith, would it? I mean, if there were evidence for it, why would you need to call it faith? You'd say just evidence. And when you said that faith in relativity, in Einstein's theory of relativity is evidence-based, that of course it is. But the evidence is all important. I mean, Einstein's predictions fit in with observed fact and with a whole body of theory, whereas we only need to use the word faith when there isn't any evidence.
I presume you've got faith in your wife. Is there any evidence for that?
Yes,
which you base it? Yes,
plenty of evidence. Let's generalize it. Never mind about my wife. Let's generalize it.
It's the same with Biden, Richard. It's the same with Biden.
Let's say that in general, how do we know that somebody loves us? Okay.
Yes.
You can use a word faith for that if you like, but it's not the right use of the word. Because,
it is.
Because you know why, you know your wife loves you because of all sorts of little signs, little catches in the voice, little looks in the eye. That's the evidence.
Yes, that's
evidence.
right.
That's perfectly good evidence. That's not faith.
Yes, it is.
Well, okay, then we're coming down to pure semantics.
I think you've been influenced too much by Kant, you see.
Well, not explicitly, I have to say. Okay, let's go on.
Okay, so this is a great clip from a very famous debate between Richard Dawkins, who's an atheist, a very famous one, and John Lennox, who's an excellent Christian scholar, who's written some very good books. I encourage you to read anything that John Lennox has written. And he's a serious scholar. He has a PhD in mathematics, amongst many other things. And so these are both guys who are professors, both intellectuals with credentials. But here we have an atheist whose view of faith is, unfortunately, is shared by many Christians. And this is what he thinks faith is. And Dr. Lennox is correct in saying, no, that's not what biblical faith is. Okay. Faith can be and is tied to reasons. And so our faith is placed not in some blind, vague thing. It's placed in God and the work of his son, and those things are most reasonable to believe in. So even as we look down and later in the talk, we're going to get to passages like Acts 26. Paul even says this. He doesn't say, oh, you need to believe Jesus and the resurrection because you have a feeling about it. He says that these things are true and reasonable because they weren't hidden in a corner. And the things of which he's speaking is the death and resurrection of Jesus. And so there we have historical arguments being put forward by Paul for why Christianity is true and reasonable. Okay, so that's just important that we deal with this, because if we have a warped understanding of the relationship with faith and reason, then what's going to end up happening is we're going to have problems with doing what we're doing today. And that is doing kind of apologetics and thinking. Because if you're hostile towards reason, you're not going to like to sit here and look at arguments, which is dealing with reason. Okay, so there is no conflict between faith and reason. And who knows, maybe, I think, Mike, you've taught on this a few times, has actually done lectures on faith and reason. And maybe in the future, if Mike has a gap, he can do a lecture for you guys specifically on the relationship on faith and reason. He's actually taught that at Baylor University, if I recall. Okay, so let's try and understand what's going on here now. All right, Rainier, can you hear me? Rainier, have you got your microphone on there?
Yes, I can hear you perfect, Simon.
Okay, so I'm going to pick on you now, okay, and use you. This is to try and make this kind of interactive. We have a picture here of some objects on our screen. And so what do you have there on the right-hand side there? What is that thing?
That is a chair.
Okay, that is a chair. What is that chair made out of?
From a distance, it seems like it's made of wood.
Yes, that's correct. It's made of wood, and for those of us who are carpenters, I'm a carpenter. That's not any old chair. Most people would just say it's a chair. That's actually a Windsor chair. Okay, it's a very, very classic design. It's been around for many centuries. It's a particularly efficient design in terms of being very light and thin, but very, very strong, because you can't really see it, but it's got certain design aspects to it which make it a very durable yet light chair. And they've been around for centuries, but in the world of carpentry, they are very difficult things to build. Okay, now I know that because I'm a carpenter. So Reinier, have you met the man who built that chair?
No, I have not.
And yet you can know something about the man, even though you haven't met him, by examining that chair. So what can we know? What can we infer from this thing that this man has made? What do we know about him?
Well, I guess we can see that he has wood as a resource, and
Yes.
that he has had a design in mind,
Yes.
which he constructed it to for a specific function.
Okay, and so would be fair to say that we could probably say that this man is a carpenter?
Yes.
Yeah, because that's not, and knowing what kind of a chair it is, I know carpenters, but people who do carpentry look at guys who build those chairs, and they're not just ordinary carpenters. People who make Windsor chairs are very, very good carpenters. I mean, that back section there on that wood, you've got to bend the wood, you've got to steam bend it. Nobody does steam bending anymore, but you've got to bend the wood in a steam machine. I mean, it's a very unusual thing, but in the old days, that's what they did. Okay, so this just isn't any carpenter. This is a good one. Okay, so what's the other object there on the screen?
I see a guitar.
What's that made out of?
Well, I guess mainly wood, but as well.
Yeah, so it's also made mainly wood. And so let's say we know that this man made the chair, but he also made the guitar. What else might we learn from the thing that he has made about that guitar? What inferences can we make from examining the things this man made?
He likes sitting and to play music.
Yes, so he obviously likes music, or even he builds it, but we know that he's got woodworking skills at one level. But man, if he's building guitars, those are also very, very delicately made things, but they're different from the other thing because it has a different nature and purpose. Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay, so it would be based upon our looking at these two objects now, we can make a pretty confident inference that this man who made, or this woman who made it, because a woman could do this as well, but let's say it's a man, let's be politically incorrect, that made this now. We know that it's a guy who made this chair and this guitar. We could know that he's a very good carpenter because he's building not only furniture, but musical instruments. So this guy's a seriously good carpenter, but he also has musical knowledge, because in order for you to build guitars, you do need to have some understanding about a musical instrument,
Yes.
Okay, so you've never met this man, Reinier, and yet we can know some things with a high degree of confidence about this person. Is that reasonable?
I think so, yes. I definitely do think
so. Here's what we've got going on. Reality can be known, okay? Truth corresponds with reality, and your mind has a capacity to make inferences. Now, this man proceeds to write Reinier a bunch of letters, okay? And he happens to write him 66 letters, okay? Some of those letters are quite long. They're almost the length of a book. Would Reinier be able to come to learn a lot more about that man from the correspondence? Would that be fair to say that?
Yes, I would say so, especially if it's personal correspondence. And am I able to write back to him?
Well, you could write back to him if you wanted to, but certainly in the correspondence back and forth, we know that you've at least got a number of letters, and it just happens to be the same amount of letters that we find in the Bible, which are kind of books as well, but there are letters as well. So what we've got going on here is through René having never bumped into this person, it doesn't mean, or even having seen him, that he's ignorant of that person altogether. Indeed, he knows much about that person through the things that that person made, in addition to the letters and correspondence from that person. And here he is. Okay, the carpenter is revealed. And so we get to know the guy there. Now, why do I do this kind of very basic thing? Well, because it's the same kind of process that's going on as we, as human beings, are confronted with revelation from God. What do I mean by that? Well, the carpenter has revealed himself to you through the things that he has made and through his correspondence. And by making an inference from those things, we come to know the nature of the carpenter. It's exactly the same process in many respects that happens with respect to God. That not as God just hasn't built some chairs and guitars, God has kind of gone over the top with creation, okay? Men build furniture, God built universes and, nature and all the rest of it, okay? So God is a little bit over the top as a creator. It's kind of excessive. It's amazing. I mean, as impressed as we might be with the chair, that picture there warrants a different response, because you are now in the company of a designer and a creator that's spectacular, okay? At another whole other level, okay? In addition to it, we have, as Christians, this tradition of saying that God hasn't only communicated to us through the creation, but through his word, and over a long period of time, not just through one individual, but through many people and over many periods of history, in good times and often in very difficult times. And the message has been consistent from beginning to end, revealing to ourselves it's the same person with the same character, with the same objectives and the same concerns and the same desires, that is to reconcile himself to men in this broken world. We see that from the beginning of the Bible all the way to the book of Revelation. Okay, so this is what's going on here. Okay, now, why am I saying that? Well, because we both can kind of evaluate that and just think about it and kind of make sense, but we can also see it in the scriptures, because we actually have the letters themselves which talk to us about this revelation. Okay, so Psalm 19, for example, talks about the heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hand. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth. So the created order is able to communicate knowledge to us, but it's not on a piece of paper. Psalm 19 says, don't look at the page, look to the heavens. There's an encounter with the created order, which is different from reading a letter, but it is speaking to you. Make no mistake about it, okay? Well, here we already begin to see potential arguments for the existence of God, and many people have written about this. There are a whole wonderful list of arguments for the existence of God from beauty, because not only do we understand the creation in terms that it's designed, but it's also beautiful. Okay, didn't have to be, it just is. Now that declares something to us about the kind of creator that God is. Okay, all right. So we have this first to take into consideration. And also here in the New Testament, we see in Romans chapter 1, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness from men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. Well, how so? Well, how has he revealed and shown us aspects of his nature? In the things that have been made. So this kind of thinking we've just had now, the cursory thinking we've been doing about our carpenter here, is exactly the same kind of thing that's going on in Romans. You are in a world and a universe in which you are bumping into all kinds of things. You are a rational being, and you can think about those things and go, I wonder where that comes from. Wow, that's an amazing thing. I wonder what made that. Whatever made that would have to itself be pretty amazing. And so we have the kind of rudimentary kind of thought processes that is onto which we begin to see the merits for many of the arguments for the existence of God. Okay, so when we talk about, because some people who get irritated with apologetics and say to them, you can't argue people into heaven. We're not attempting to argue people into heaven, okay? Nobody is argued into heaven because people will have to deal with their sin first, and that's not a rational issue, that's a moral issue, and that's the work of the Holy Spirit. But it doesn't mean that it's just that. There are reasons for believing here. And the scripture is clear in these two passages, and there are many others that we can make reference to, but these two specifically talk about that it's very reasonable to believe in the existence of God from the things that have been made. And there we've got a very basic level. If you're just speaking to somebody on the street, you can just start there with them in a personal evangelism. Well, what do you think of the world around us? I mean, it's beautiful. It has the appearance of design. If it has design, is there a designer? Is that a reasonable inference? Yeah, it seems very reasonable to conclude that. And we're going to look at some of the claims and some of the statements of skeptics themselves as we move through the talk. Okay, so let's look at our next slide. In addition to that, because we live in a very, very complex world, and there's many different aspects to the world. It is mathematical, it is logical, it's historical. There is an aesthetic dimension, but there's also a dimension to the universe, which is that we live in a universe that's moral. We live in a moral universe. And in some sense, our views and understandings of morality might be some of the most important things that we as human beings know and understand. Because when we fail to deal with the reality of morality, we end up with societies which are just carnage. Okay, so morality is a big part of our universe, and any worldview which cannot give me a meaningful understanding of the nature of this dimension of the universe, in my estimation, is a worldview that has some serious problems, because I'm looking for a worldview that has explanatory scope and power, one which can give an accounting for the beauty in the universe, for the moral component, for the rational component, for the mathematical component, for the design component, and so forth and so on. Here we have in Romans chapter 2, more scripture which speaks about this. In this case, this verse here talks about the moral law. For all who have sinned are without the law will also perish without the law, and all who have sinned under the law will be judged by the law. For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified. For when Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature, do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on that day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. This is a very, very, very important verse here, because we see Paul in the book of Romans saying, it's not just the Jews who have the law, the Gentiles have this law. Well, how do we know that they have it? Well, we can examine them, look at their consciences, okay? We are rational beings, we have a conscience. And you can talk, and you ought to talk to a lot of people about this aspect of human nature. What is that all about? Where did that come from? Are you just a cosmic accident? Do physics and chemistry care about how you act and what you do? Seems like you do. You care very much about how people act and what they do, especially if part of those actions are injurious to you or your family. And so even if you have a worldview which denies that there is such a thing as morality, you don't behave like that. You live and expect others to follow these laws. Well, who made them up? Did we just invent them? Or do these laws come from somewhere else? So we're going to look at some aspects of that. Okay, so we live in a moral universe as well. We live in a historical universe, and we see this in Acts 17, that God is very serious about history, that he has communicated to us through history, that history belongs to God as well. All of it belongs to God. The times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he hath fixed a day on which he would judge the world by righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given us what? Assurance. God doesn't expect you to believe blindly. He's given you assurance to us all by raising him from the dead. There is the preaching of the resurrection of Jesus. These things are true and reasonable because they weren't done in a corner. So God just doesn't expect you to believe blindly. He has given you assurance of these things, that they are true, by raising Jesus from the dead. Okay. So when people say to me they don't know God or they can't see God, okay, don't panic. Start talking about God's revelation. Unpack this for them, because people are bumping into God more often than they think, and are having encounters with God which they don't think are actually going on there. I mean, I say this to a lot of people. They bump into a lot of charismatic Pentecostal Christians and say, I don't have those kinds of religious experiences. I'm not encountering God. And then I'll just ask him, I said to him, so when you do things wrong and you do sinful things, do you feel guilty about it? Well, yeah. I said to him, well, according to Christianity, you're having an encounter with God there. Remember, the conviction of your sin it's not a pleasant encounter. It's not a pleasant experience. Nobody likes to talk about it. But make no mistake, the conviction of your sin is encounter with the God of the universe. Okay, very important for us to make mention of that as well. Okay, there are these verses again. God has given us evidence to believe in him. And so what we've got here is what is coming together is general and special revelation. General revelation would be the creation and created order. Special revelation would be the word of God. And these things come together. There's a congruence between these two things, okay? But what we also have going on here is rationality and reason, and that's important. As Christians, we need to love God, not just with our hearts, but our minds. We need to think, okay? But it's also true that we don't know everything by reason, okay? And there are things that we can know by authority, okay? What do I mean by that? Okay. If Rainier, for example, I went to visit Rainier and we were busy cooking in the kitchen, okay, and a fire broke out in the kitchen, and let's pick somebody else over here. Let's pick, who's in here? This is Ananya. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, so Ananya is has taken up a new profession, and she's been been serving in the fire department for the last 10 years. And there, Rainier and I are cooking on the stove, frying a lekker piece of boerewors and making something, and there's a big fire. And I don't know what to do, and so I'm looking panicked. I look to Rainier. We're making like some lekker chips as well. Oil's hot, it's caught on fire. Rainier rushes to the sink. He grabs a bucket of water. He's about to throw the bucket of water on the stove. And Ananya says, stop. Okay. And then he says, why? I'm going to put the fire out. Ananya says, you don't throw water on an oil fire. Now, Ananya knows about that because she's been working in the fire service for the last 10 years. So she's an expert. She's an authority on fires. Is it reasonable to trust what he says? Well, of course it is. She's an expert on fires. Listen to her, or you're going to make it even worse. Okay. Now, when you go to university, we take young students out of school and we send them to universities where we hope that the professors under which our students sit then, sitting at the feet who have people who are authorities in specific fields. That doesn't make them an authority in all things. Okay, and that's the mistake of a lot of students. Just because you've got a smart professor there of civil engineering doesn't qualify him to be an expert in everything in life. In fact, there are many scholars who, whilst being experts in their fields, in other areas of their lives, it's a train wreck. And you have no business listening to them when they give you commentary on those other things. You might want to listen to them when they teach you on chemistry or whatever. And you should do that and have respect for that. But that doesn't make them authority in all things. Or when it comes to God and he's the ultimate authority, when he speaks to certain things, then you ought to listen. Okay? Because he's God. Now, he's given reasons to believe. And just because you don't necessarily have a reason for this particular thing that he's commanded you, you can believe it on the basis of the authority of God. Okay? So we don't know everything as Christians by reasons. We do believe a number of things in the Christian faith on the basis of the authority of God. Okay? So let me test Mike now. Mike, what would be one thing that we could believe on the basis of the authority of the God?
Well, it's one thing to believe that Jesus died by crucifixion. It's another thing to believe that by doing so, he atoned for the sins of the world. We might be able, and I think, in fact, we can and should believe that he was crucified by way of the historical evidence that we have for that. But in order to believe that in dying by crucifixion, he atoned for the sins of the world, we have to take God's word on that and trust the testimony of Jesus himself, who said that he would be delivered over to the hands of sinful men and give his life as a ransom for many. And Paul attests to his dying for our sins in accordance with the scriptures, as do the other apostles. And because they are apostles, because they have been commissioned by Christ, who has risen from the dead, we can trust their testimony that when Christ died by crucifixion, he was in fact saving the world in doing so. But that isn't something we would be able to know apart from that testimony.
Okay, so Mark's helped us here now, very helpful. So, for example, the question of the death of Jesus is just a historical question. Jesus was either crucified under Pontius Pilate or not. Well, even the most strident skeptics of Christianity believe that. Okay, that's just a historical fact. Now, the resurrection is a different question because it's a supernatural event. But of course, if the eyewitnesses who were there with Jesus are reliable, we ought to believe them. If we're going to believe them in one thing, then we need to believe them in another thing. But then Mark pushes us further and saying, well, the events aren't just historical. There are theological implications and moral implications for the work of Jesus. Okay, and so Jesus goes to the cross, dies on the cross for the sins of all men. John 3:16 and many other verses speak of that. And God loves the world, he sent his son so that we might all have eternal life. Okay. Now, how does that work? We can say some things about it. Why is it enough to satisfy God? There are many questions that we don't have answers to as Christians. Okay. But because God accepts it, we too can accept it. Okay. And so that's on the basis of the authority of God. Okay. And so some things we can know by reason and some things we can take on the basis of authority. But that's not abandoning our minds or falling foul of the skeptics of just being, blind and not being free thinkers. Most everything that most other people believe, including the atheists and the critics, they believe on the basis of authority themselves. Why? Because as a finite being, you only have a certain level of access to this world to know certain things. And a lot of what you believe is on the basis of the authority of other individuals. And that's very reasonable to trust in that. Now, it doesn't mean that those authorities are always right. We can examine them. Okay. And so too with God. God is an authority and he calls us to examine the scriptures, to test these things. We shouldn't be afraid of calling people to investigate the claims of the Christian faith and to put them to the test and to evaluate them in an honest way. Because if it's true, we have nothing to fear. Okay. So thank you, Ananya, for helping us with your wonderful experience in the fire department of South Africa, saving Renier from burning his house down by throwing water on that chip pan fire.
Dis reg, is 'n plesier. Ek sal vir julle 'n uurpraaier kry.
All right, yeah, there we go. All right, so now we have this now. We're going to move to some of the arguments now. So this is how an argument works. Here we have a syllogism. What is a syllogism? A syllogism is the most basic form of argument that you can get. It's two premises followed by a conclusion. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, and there's the conclusion, therefore Socrates is immortal. Okay, if the two premises are true, okay, and the reasoning in the argument is valid, then the conclusion is sound, okay, then you ought to believe that. Okay, all right, and you're irrational not to believe that. And so this is kind of a structure of an argument at a very basic level. So we can then talk about certain premises which we take to be true, and if those premises are true, then what follows from those premises is a conclusion that is also true and sound and ought to be believed. So here's a basic argument. We're going to look at some philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Why are we going to start with that? Well, because there are actually many philosophical arguments for the existence of God and varieties of cosmological arguments. We don't have time to look all into them, but let's just begin with a very basic one here. The universe began to exist. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, therefore the universe has a cause. Okay, now if those two premises are true, then the conclusion follows. All right, of course, if the universe has a cause, we would then want to know what is the nature of that cause. Okay, now many Christian scholars through the centuries have given these arguments. In fact, you can find rudimentary formulations of these arguments going all the way back to pagan philosophers and the pre-Socratics, then through Plato and Aristotle and on to great thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. We can see that these arguments have been around, and not only within the Christian tradition, but also even within the Islamic tradition as well. Okay, and so that's what we've got going on here. So how should we kind of formulate this argument? Well, what I've got here is a short video for you guys to watch, which kind of puts this cosmological argument together. It's one version of it. It's called the Quran cosmological argument, okay? And it's been packaged nicely here now. So put on your thinking cap and let's see what's going on here.
Does God exist? Or is the material universe all that is, or ever was, or ever will be? One approach to answering this question is the cosmological argument. It goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe has a cause. Is the first premise true? Let's consider. Believing that something can pop into existence without a cause is more of a stretch than believing in magic. At least with magic, you've got a hat and a magician. And if something can come into being from nothing, then why don't we see this happening all the time? No, everyday experience and scientific evidence confirm our first premise. If something begins to exist, it must have a cause. But what about our second premise? Did the universe begin, or has it always existed? Atheists have typically said that the universe has been here forever. The universe is just there, and that's all. First, let's consider the second law of thermodynamics. It tells us the universe is slowly running out of usable energy, and that's the point. If the universe had been here forever, it would have run out of usable energy by now. The second law points us to a universe that has a definite beginning. This is further confirmed by a series of remarkable scientific discoveries. In 1915, Albert Einstein presented his general theory of relativity. This allowed us, for the first time, to talk meaningfully about the past history of the universe. Next, Alexander Friedman and George Lemaitre, each working with Einstein's equations, predicted that the universe is expanding. Then in 1929, Edwin Hubble measured the redshift in light from distant galaxies. This empirical evidence confirmed not only that the universe is expanding, but that it sprang into being from a single point in the finite past. It was a monumental discovery, almost beyond comprehension. However, not everyone is fond of a finite universe, so it wasn't long before alternative models popped into existence. But one by one, these models failed to stand the test of time. More recently, three leading cosmologists, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin, proved that any universe which has on average been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. This even applies to the multiverse, if there is such a thing. This means that scientists can no longer hide behind a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. Any adequate model must have a beginning, just like the standard model. It's quite plausible then that both premises of the argument are true. This means that the conclusion is also true. The universe has a cause. And since the universe can't cause itself, its cause must be beyond the space-time universe. It must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, and unimaginably powerful, much like God. The cosmological argument shows that, in fact, it is quite reasonable to believe that God does exist.
Okay, so what we have here is a formulation of the cosmological argument put together with a scholar, Dr. William Lane Craig, who you can go on to YouTube and look at a lot of his work, particularly in this area of arguments for the existence of God and some of the historical stuff on Jesus. He's outstanding, and I encourage you to check out his work there. A friend of mine who's a graphics guy helped him put together this video, and my wife did the voice for this video, but it captures the argument. It's quite thick because it mentions a lot of scientists whom you've probably never heard of, but it just shows you that these arguments aren't divorced from science. In fact, they're actually square up quite nicely with what many of these scientists are saying. Not that I could referee that debate, because neither Mike nor I are scientists. So at some level, this argument is philosophical, but it also has some scientific knowledge possible. But we can also look at this argument and in a basic way, just think about it as we bump into things in this world. I find it to be a very compelling argument, but I also think there's other simple ways that we can kind of communicate the heart of this kind of thinking to people with respect to this philosophical argument. That is, where we have certain things that come into existence in the world around us, and we have to ask, well, where did those things come from? And if we understand where the things that cause those things, well, we can just keep asking the question. The problem is you cannot keep asking that question infinitely, because you end up with an infinite regress problem. Okay, and what am I talking about there? Well, this next slide is going to help us to kind of get at the heart of this argument. Let's pick on Rainier again. Okay, Rainier, are we ready? You ready for us to pick on you again?
Absolutely.
Okay, so Rainier is standing at a railway line, and he sees one of these things here, a boxcar coming past him. Okay, all right, and as he's standing there, he sees this thing pass him, but it's not by itself. It's tied to a bunch of other things like it. Okay, now does Rainier then look to himself and go, wow, that's interesting. I guess that carries on infinitely. You know, there's another one of those same things attached to it, and there's another one attached to that, and they just keep coming past me. Now Rainier knows that if he's got one of these things coming past him and another one attached to him, that doesn't carry on infinitely, because he knows something about the nature. Or let's find out if he does. What is the nature of this thing in front of you, Rainier? What is its purpose?
Well, its purpose is to transport cargo, I would think.
Yeah, that's right. It's a boxcar. It's for carrying stuff. Okay, but it lacks certain things. What can it not do?
I guess it can't make something.
It can't make something, and it can't make itself do what? It can't make itself move.
Yes.
Okay. Rainier knows that however long that line is, okay, there's an aspect and nature to this thing which it lacks, that it's a part of what's going on with it. Okay, all right. So he knows at the end of this line, there is something that has a different nature. There's one of these things. Okay, all right, because you need one of these things to push those other things. Okay, and everybody understands this intuitively. And this is kind of helpful for us when we think about the cosmological argument. We bump into things in this world that have a particular nature. They have a finite nature, okay, all right? And they might cause other things, and they themselves are caused by other finite things. But you cannot have that chain going on like that forever, okay?
So Simon,
Yes.
If I can maybe just ask if you could just give us as jy net vir ons kan verduidelik wat is finite and infinite. I think that would help us a bit.
Okay, when we talk about things and in creation, all things that you bump into or you know of in creation are finite. That is, that they are limited. They have a limit. They occupy a limited amount of space. You know, I'm 6'2", bald, and occupy so much space, and I'm currently planted in South Africa. My house is in Potchefstroom. It is so many meters by so many meters, made up of so many materials. Okay, and I know that it has limitations. It's finite. It came into existence. Okay, my house didn't always exist. It didn't always have to exist. There was a crew of men who showed up here years ago and built it. Okay, well, every single thing you bump into in the world around you, okay, is much like that. It came into being. Okay, it has a contingent nature, that it is dependent upon something else for explaining where it came from. Well, you cannot keep having an infinite series of those same kinds of things. In order to explain all of it, you need one thing that it itself does not have the same nature. Okay, it needs to have a different nature. In the same way that the locomotive has a different nature from the boxcar, we can look at creation and say, if all the things in created order have a contingent nature, then what we require then is one thing that doesn't have the same kind of nature. Well, what would that nature be? Number one, at least at minimum, it would have to be immensely powerful, because whatever puts all of that into existence would have to have ridiculous power. Number two, it cannot be material, because the things we're speaking of are material, they're physical. It cannot be physical, because then it would just be another one of those things. So it has to be immaterial. Okay. The things that we experience in our world are also temporal. They're in time. That thing would have to be non-temporal. It would have to be eternal. Okay. So from understanding the nature of the things around us, we can make an inference to the thing that explains them. Well, think about what we just read in Romans chapter 1. It said there that we can know something about the eternal attributes of God from the things that have been made. Because we know the nature of the things that have been made, we can conclude that God is very powerful, that he is not physical, okay, and that he is eternal. He's eternal nature. Those are at least some of them, of the important attributes of God. Okay, so you see how Romans 1 is kind of giving you a simplistic understanding of this cosmological argument there. All right, let's ask our expert on this today. What do you think about that, Mark? Is there anything else you'd like to add to help us understand this basic kind of first flyover of the cosmological argument?
So you've mentioned a number of important attributes that the cause has to be enormously powerful, has to be immaterial. One other thing that's perhaps important to highlight is that it has to be personal as well. And you might wonder how we know that. Well, there's a few different arguments you might appeal to here, or one might appeal to, but I think the most convincing one to me has to do with the nature of causes. Now, broadly speaking, there are two kinds of causes that occur. There are event causes, that is one event causing another event. So when the pool cube strikes the billiard ball, and that the event of the pool cube striking the billiard ball causes the ball to roll, and the rolling of the ball eventually causes the striking of another billiard ball, and this sort of thing. So you have events causing events, and then the other sort of causing that you have are agents or persons causing various things. So I, by way of intending to raise my arm and exerting my will, can cause my arm to raise. And so we have these two kinds of causings, event causings and what are called agent causings. So then the question is, what sort of causing is the causing of the universe. Well, given that the universe has a beginning, that time itself has a beginning, and we can appeal to various scientific and philosophical arguments for that, the causing of the universe can't be an event causing, because it is the very first event, and so that event can't be caused by a prior event. And so the only other possibility is that the beginning of the universe is caused by an agent, caused by something endowed with a will, caused by a person. And so we can know not only that this cause has to be immaterial, that it's to be immensely powerful, but that it's also personal, which rules out a whole lot of New Age worldview kind of
Pantheism.
scenarios, like pantheism and panentheism and other forms, whereby there's some sort of higher force or higher power, but it's not personal, it doesn't care about us, this sort of thing. We can rule out all those worldviews by attending to the fact that the cause of the beginning of the universe has to be personal as well as very powerful and immaterial, and obviously then very intelligent in order to intricately design the whole of physical reality the way that we see it.
Yeah, so what Mike is helping us to unpack is actually, if we begin to think about the world in which you find yourself, these aspects of the world have to have an accounting for them. There has to be something which explains it. And the Christian would argue the best explanation for it in all its rich diversity is God. And so we just have to follow that line of thinking here now. Now, this is a philosophical argument. We've looked at here the Kalam. There are varieties of Kalam arguments, okay? And it's sometimes difficult for people to try and think about it, but there you have it. You can rewatch Rainier's posting on it if you want to go over it again. When I was learning about these arguments, I sometimes had to want to go over them. So I want to hear that again so I can kind of have another crack at understanding it and getting my teeth into it. And you should do that so that you can kind of, in a way, give yourself time to see the argument, to kind of understand. It's like looking at a maths problem and you study it and it doesn't make sense. You go back and have a look at it. And finally, when you get that equation, then you go, I get it there. Sometimes it's like that. So don't feel embarrassed if you feel like you've been kind of thrown into a swimming pool with a big millstone around your neck. You've got your life there in front of you now, and this is part of having your mind expanded by God, and to think about His creation. And like I said to you, it's not that the truth of Christianity is just dependent upon the cosmological argument and the Kalam version of it. There are many other arguments now, so we want to look at some of these now. What we're going to move on to next now
Simon,
is, yes.
So I just quickly want to thank you, Will, and then nou as ek nou dalk net oor kan gaan in Afrikaans, so ek, of kom ek sê, as ek nou al met mense in gesprek getree het, dan sal die volgende gewoonlik gebeur. Dan vra ek vir hulle, glo jy in God? En dan sê die persoon, nee, ek is nie seker nie, want jy sê, God het die wêreld gemaak en alles daarin, maar wie het vir God gemaak? En as iemand vir God gemaak het, wie het dan nou weer vir daai God gemaak? En wie het daai God gemaak? En wie het daai God gemaak? So hierdie oneindigende in die sirkel argumenteer, en ek het agtergekom dat die kosmologiese argument die beste antwoord daarvoor is. So kan jy dalk net vir ons die verskillende maniere verduidelik hoe om die probleem aan te val wanneer iemand met daai vraag kom, want ek ervaar dit is baie Christene het daai ervaring, het daai belewenis, en maar ook dan nou nie Christen nie. So dit is amper soos 'n natuurlike vraag wat ontstaan, soos wat ons met die wêreld en alles in aanraking is. So asseblief, Simon.
No, that's a very common and very popular level objection. In fact, it's not just come from skeptics, it'll come from your kids. Okay, when you get married and have kids, and I've got a few of them, I've got 5, kids ask this question: if God made everything, well, then who made God? Now, it's even most recently in Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, it's the kind of objection he's raised against Christianity. Now, first of all, we need to say two things. Please understand that what belongs to you as a believer is the history of the church, and there's 2,000 years of it. So it's not like when that question gets raised that the church hasn't thought about, like, wow, we never thought about that one, okay? If you look historically, you'll see a long time ago, this objection had been answered, okay, all right? And what we want to do is we can use the cosmological argument to respond to that. When the person says, who made God, okay, what they're assuming in their objection is that God is like the other things out there, okay? And that's not what we're saying, okay? What we're saying is, if we understand the nature of the things in this world, then it follows philosophically, not just because the Bible says so, it follows reasonably and rationally. Even Plato and Aristotle understood this, that whatever explains those things cannot have the same nature, because then it would just be another one of those things. So God has to have a different nature, and something like that is required to explain the nature of everything else. So when you ask the question, who made God, in some sense, you're guilty of committing what is called a category mistake, okay? Because God's not the kind of thing that came into being, okay? It's like asking, where's the bachelor's wife, okay? All right? And it's not just because the Bible says so, it's because if we think about the nature of the world around us, the world in which all people live, including the atheist, he knows what the nature of things are. And the nature of things is that they're finite, they're contingent, okay, they're limited, and they're temporal. Or whatever explains that itself cannot have that nature, because then it would just be another one of those things. Whatever explains that would have to have a different nature, okay? And this is where we map onto the argument. So this is how the cosmological argument helps us. Mike wants to jump in here and say a few things as well.
Yeah, so maybe 2 quick points. First of all, it's important to, and actually it'll be good that you all have the PowerPoint, right? That they have access to this. So you can go back and look. But the way that the argument was initially laid out was everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. So that first premise was not that everything has a cause. Rather, it was that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And so the reason God does not have to have a cause is because God does not begin to exist. So it's important to keep in mind exactly the nature of the argument that's being put forward. Secondly, if we just think about the fact that certain things cause other things in the world, even if we don't want to say everything that begins to exist has a cause, I think that's true, but certain people quibble about various quantum events and this kind of thing. But just think about the fact that there are certain events that we know cause other events. Well, either those events are caused by other events, and those events are caused by further events, and those are caused by further events, and this goes backwards forever, or there is a cause that is itself not caused by anything. So the only 2 possibilities are that you either have an infinite chain of causes. You have one thing caused by another thing, which is caused by another thing, which is caused by another thing, backwards forever, or you have a cause that is not itself caused by anything. Those are the only 2 options. And then if we know that the universe had a beginning, which we can know from both scientific and philosophical reasoning, then we know that there couldn't have been an infinite chain of causes that extends back forever. And so we can, just by reflection, discern that there must be a cause that was not itself caused by anything. And so this isn't some instance of what's called special pleading, where you try to make an exception to a rule to save your argument from refutation. This is something that we can see just by reason alone, that there must be a cause that is not caused by anything else.
All right. So hopefully that made sense. And like I said to you, with you recording it, if you want to go back and listen to Mike also unpacking it in greater detail, do avail yourself of that. But like I said to you, we're going to need to move on now because we've got a few other arguments we want to do. And like I said,
Yes.
it's important for you to understand that the arguments we're giving here, and that's just one argument. There are many arguments. Of course, if you don't find that argument compelling, fair enough. I find it very compelling. I know that there is aspects to it which I don't know much about, but in its basic formulation, it pretty much maps onto what we see in Romans chapter 1. And a lot of people, when you run this past them, even if they don't know a lot about this stuff, they go, yeah, that makes sense. That's fairly reasonable to believe. Well, that's all we're asking for you. That's what the Bible says. Give a hope for the reasons within you. Well, here's a reason to believe in the existence of God, at least one of them. Okay.
So Simon,
yes.
net gou vinnig. So William Lim kry die video wat julle mee gehelp het, wat ons nou gekyk het vir my baie mooi verduidelik wat ons eintlik by uitkom as ons met mense gesels wat daai vraag het, en dan om vir hulle te vra, okay, wat is jou definisie van God, en nadat hulle dit vir jou gedeel het, dan kan jy vir hulle moontlik sê, hierdie is die definisie van God volgens die Bybel. Wat dan nou byvoorbeeld hardloop en hier moet jy my asseblief help, want ek vergeet gewoonlik die formaat, maar om te sê dat God is buite tyd, God is nie materieel nie, so hy is buite spasie, God is almagtig, God is persoonlik, en ek dink daar's nog enetjie wat ek gemis het.
Yes. So those conclusions in terms of the inference to the nature of God, like we made the inference from the chair and the guitar, that the person who built them was a really good carpenter and knew something about music, we are making the same inference to the attributes of God from the things that we bump into in creation. Okay. It's exactly the same line of thinking and reasoning that's going on there, okay? So we can know those attributes about God from the things that have been made. That's exactly what Romans 1 says, and the Quran kind of helps to unpack that thinking for us. So the reason why we say God has these attributes is not just because the Bible says so. This is our congruent theology. This is general and special revelation. Suppose we didn't have the Bible, you can still reach these conclusions from just looking at creation. So for the atheist who says, well, I don't believe the Bible, he's not off the hook. He's not living in some different universe. He's living in the same universe he's living in, and he also bumps into the same things that you bump into, and they have the same nature for him as they do for you. Well, if that's the case, we can say to him, you can know God from those things. You don't need to appeal to the Bible. It just happens to be the case that when we think about the world around us philosophically and scientifically, that the conclusions we reach there, that there is a being behind it all, just so happens to have the same very attributes that we see of God in Genesis and through the rest of Scripture. Okay? And so there we got these things coming together. So what we find in nature is consistent with what we come in Scripture. Now, if God is the author of both, then we should expect precisely that, which is exactly what we get. Does that help?
Ek dink dit is perfek. So ja, as ek julle kan aanraai, gaan kyk na meer na Dr. William Lane Kruit se video's, gaan na Ratio Christie en lees en kyk soveel as moontlik. Daar's baie lekker populêre argumente wat ons help om dit beter te formuleer, sodat mense meer kan verstaan wat ons glo en hoekom dit glo. En ek hou baie van wat jy sê, Simon, dat die naturalis of die ateïs het nie eintlik 'n plek om na te hardloop nie, want ons kan dit dan nou sien in die algemene openbaring van God deur die skepping of die ontwerpsargument, En dan as die persoon dan 'n bietjie van 'n agtergrond het van die Bybel, dan kan ons hulle geloof sterker en vasser maak, as ek dit so kan stel, om vir hulle te wys, luister, jy, soos wat jy vir ons begin het in die slide, dat jy's nie besig om iets irrasioneel te glo nie, maar jy's eintlik regtig besig om iets rasioneel te glo en konstant, wat eintlik teruggaan nog voor Christendom. So dankie daarvoor, Simon.
No, that's right. I encourage all of you. You know, you don't have to learn this overnight, but I encourage all of you for your own edification and encouragement to study these things. It will really increase your confidence in the truth of Christianity and embolden and strengthen your faith. The next argument we're going to deal with is a design argument. This is also a different kind of argument. Now, Mike and I always have these infernal battles about this because he loves the philosophical arguments. I really like the design arguments. Maybe it's because I like to design and build stuff. And so these ones I've always found to be, in some sense, more compelling than the philosophical arguments, although I have a great appreciation for the philosophical arguments. The design argument is kind of different then. Okay, so let's pick on somebody else in our crew here. Who else do we have here now? We picked on Ananya. Now, who are the other two ladies who are a part of this? Is it two other ladies we have with us here?
Dis Lumay en Yashel.
Okay, let's pick on Yashel. Let's pick on her then. Okay, Yashel, put your mic on there. What is this thing that we have in front of us here?
Horlosie, oom.
Do you know that if you go down to Mossel Bay and you stand on the beach for long enough, that these things just wash up on the beach? You know?
Ja,
no, seriously, I've been down there, and you have to be patient, but sooner or later, these things that just get washed out on the beach. It's amazing what the ocean can do.
Okay.
Now, Yashel is laughing at me, and rightly so, because she thinks, gee whiz, what is that Engelsman there in Potch thinking? What is he actually smoking? I mean, you all know that if there are watches on the beach, either somebody dropped it there or a container ship full of wash things fell off and these things are getting washed up. But natural laws and waves and wind and beach and sand doesn't produce that, because that thing has a particular aspect to it. And so if you were to find this watch on a beach, Yashel, what would you think to yourself?
Ja, iemand het dit dalk verloor of.
That's right. Okay, now, when I'm teaching on arguments for the existence of God, and I've had to teach this kind of stuff to 5-year-olds, they all get this. When I start talking about the beach, they start laughing at me, saying, oh, you're trying to make a joke. You know, you're obviously the old man. They said, no, you're just trying to make a joke. And I'm like, but they get the point. We can see design. Okay, so then the next question we have to ask ourselves as we consider these things, well, in nature, we're confronted with certain patterns in nature. We have one pattern on the side screen there. We kind of see these patterns in the sand. We see it's a consistency and there's a pattern there. But then we also, when we examine something like this, like an eye, we also see that there's patterns there, that there is structure there. The question, of course, is, do the laws of nature have the capacity, the same laws which produce the patterns in the sand, do those laws have the capacity to produce something like the thing on the left there they are? That's the question, okay? Now, if you're an atheist, you have to say, well, yes, okay? If you're a Christian, you might say, well, no, because whilst I see the patterns in sand or in crystals, what we have in front of us, is something far more complex than that. And you're going to need more than just physical laws to give an accounting over what for this thing on the left there, okay? All right. Now, the reason why the question raises is not because we just have one example which begs explaining. The problem is we've got this, okay? There's a profusion or an overwhelmingness, if I could invent that word, as I said in the beginning, in the world in which we find ourselves, in that it is just full of this kind of stuff. And the complexity and the design is not just an eye. It's so far beyond that. We could just take the tiger, for example. Well, the tiger has an eye. That begs explaining. But the tiger has a whole slew of all kinds of other amazing systems, and all put together into this thing called a big cat that you need to avoid. Okay. It's got sensory faculties, from smell, taste, the whiskers, hearing, digestive systems, reproductive systems, and on it goes, from a big level right down to the single cells that are different, so that the cells in its eyes serve a particular purpose for doing something with light. These things are immensely complicated. Okay. Now, if you're an atheist, you have no other recourse but to look at that and go, that is just a cosmic accident. Okay. Some laws of nature, and in their case, it's kind of evolutionary thinking, explains that. To those of us who are Christians, we look at that and go, well, we see that the laws of nature can do some things. It can make patterns in the sands and maybe make crystals. But those laws in and of themselves aren't able to give you this kind of design, the kind of purpose that we see in these things. Something else must explain that. Now, as a Christian, we can say, yeah, it's God, because God in his mind had a pattern or a form of these things, and he designed the fish with the purpose of being the kind of thing that can breathe underwater and swim. He designed the dragonfly to be the kind of thing that has amazing eyesight, but it can fly. It has purpose. The flight isn't just an interesting accident of nature. It's been intended. In the same way that you see the intentionality in the guitar, that this isn't a thing to sit on, it's a thing to be strummed and to produce a certain thing, which that being music, it has purpose. There's intentionality here. We see that here just on a whole other level. Okay. So as the atheist says that the laws of nature are undirected and purposeless, we would say that's wrong. Okay, now, why should we start here? Well, because we should start here because, like I said to you, whilst atheists and skeptics can reject the Bible, they're also confronted with tigers and dragonflies and fish and all kinds of cool things, and peacocks and trees and flowers and orchids, and okay. And let's listen to what they say. Here, Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist we were introduced at the beginning of the talk, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Okay. Natural selection is the blind watchmaker, blind because it does not see ahead, does not plan consequences, has no purpose in view, yet delivering results of natural selection overwhelmingly impress us with the illusion of design and planning. Hang on, Richard. So what we see there is just an illusion with respect to design and planning. The design and planning is not really there. It's just accidental. Yep, that's what he's saying. Well, I'm going to say no. I would argue that your intuitions, that the overwhelmingly, which they're conceding, the overwhelming impression of design begs a certain inference that if there is this kind of design, that there must be a designer. I'm going to argue, as we're going to see here, that Richard Dawkins is inconsistent, because when Richard Dawkins bumps into watches on beaches, he doesn't say, wow, it's amazing. Look at the design on that thing that the ocean just produced. No, Richard knows that watches have complicated designs and that those kinds of designs come from human beings. The problem for Richard Dawkins is that the things he studies, biological cells, are far more complicated and far more designed than any watch that's ever been built by any person. In fact, the things that we can encounter in the design and biology make the things that human beings build look rather stupid. That's how complex they are. So Richard Dawkins is unfortunate because he's having to live his life making this consistent, inconsistent inference as he lives and walks through his life. He's making it in one instance, on the one hand, in this case, with respect to other things that people make. And yet when he's confronted with design in nature, he says, nah, this is all just an accidental cosmic accident through the blind watchmaker, the laws of natural selection. So I'm going to say to the Christian, stick with your initial intuition about these things. If there is an overwhelming impression of design in nature, then there must be a designer. Okay. Now, the reason why I like these arguments is because it's kind of easy as a starting point to point towards it, because everybody's in nature. And of course, here in South Africa, we live in a particular beautiful part of the world. So we're surrounded by this stuff. So I can just point at it and say, well, what explains that? Okay. And that's where most people are with the arguments, but we can dig deeper into this then. So we want to ask ourselves, is this an illusion of design? I would argue no. This thing has purpose. The eye has a particular purpose and function, that is to see. Okay. And it's just one aspect of your anatomy and physiology. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is, contrary to what our skeptical friends say, that is that Christianity and Christians are irrational and unscientific. The truth is actually completely different. The truth is that the Christian faith, to a large extent, established the modern scientific enterprise. Okay, there are a number of scientists whom names you may have heard, who actually established the very different fields of science. I'm just going to name a few scientific lightweights in the history of science: Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, Johannes Kepler, James Clerk Maxwell, Charles Babbage, Mark and I were discussing him the other day, Heisenberg, and on the list goes. All these men were believers. Faith and reason are not at odds with each other. These men are giants. They've established certain disciplines. In fact, they're the greatest scientists who've ever lived. They were all Christians. So faith and reason is not an age. And when they looked at the universe, they didn't say, oh, that's just some kind of cosmic accident. They said, no, there's a God behind it. And how they would serve God is by investigating his revelation. Okay. And we've done this now. So science, interestingly, science hasn't gotten rid of religion. Science has actually painted the skeptics into the corner, whether they're looking at it on a massive level, in terms of Hubble telescopes, and looking at it from the large size right down to the small. Okay, so we're going to look at some arguments that deal with this kind of design arguments. This is a version of a design argument, also packaged for us. Let's think about this one. I'm going to run that again.
From galaxies and stars down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or Another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect monkeyed with physics and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
Okay, so there we had another short video which kind of compacts that for us. It's a design argument. This is called a fine-tuning argument. And notice here in the video, I mean, a lot of it's fairly technical science, but notice here how the people there that are quoted are all serious scientists who really, if you think about it, are making these confessions about the nature of the universe and saying, look, science has shown to us that one aspect of this universe is that it is governed by these laws and these laws are so finely tuned, it seems like there's a super intellect behind it all. Okay. Now, this picture here, slide here, is a picture of Anthony Flew. Before Richard Dawkins became so famous as an atheist, okay, this guy, Anthony Flew, was the most famous atheist in the world. As a result of these fine-tuning arguments and some other arguments, this atheist, prominent atheist, moved from being an atheist to a deist. He was kind of a philosophical deist, which is a huge step for somebody of his, given his career as an atheist, famous atheist, on the basis of the arguments and the science. Now, we're not sure whether he became a believer, because towards the end of his life, there were some Christian brothers who were speaking to him about the New Testament and the gospel. But I mean, it just is an admission of the seismic shift as a result of science and these arguments. And so it's often interesting to hear about these testimonies. I've never read the book. I should like to get myself a copy of that book and read it when I get a chance. Anthony Flew. All right. So we looked at things from a large scale. The design arguments, the fine-tuning arguments are pretty compelling. If somebody was to ask me practically, how do I communicate that to people at the street level? I kind of say to them, it's kind of like having a shower, okay? And the shower has 1,000 taps, okay? And each tap has to be turned, okay, in order for you to have a shower. But the problem with the shower is that the taps all have to be in a very specific position, to a millimeter, okay, all 100 taps, okay? And if you do not get those taps in all exactly the same position, you either freeze to death or you burn to death, because it's either scalding hot or it jets out freezing water, okay? So who's going to climb in the shower? Well, nobody. Yet we find ourselves in a universe in some sense where all of these features to the universe, all of these laws governing our planet, okay, are finely tuned, finely adjusted, okay? And if they were just a little bit off, we wouldn't exist. There would be nothing. Okay, so that kind of helps me unpack that kind of fine-tuning argument for people. All right, but we can say, well, that's a little bit beyond me now. Well, how about going from the big to the small? We now live in an age not just where we can look at galaxies, but we can look into the small. We can look into our body, into the cells with electron microscopes. Yeah, we see a hypodermic needle. Those are individual red blood cells on the end of a hypodermic needle. You can actually count them out there, okay? But we can go even much smaller than that, okay? Why is this important? Well, in South Africa, interestingly enough, we live in a country in which we have arguably one of the major bastions or institutions to which so many skeptics and atheists are appealing to shore up their commitments to evolution. And what is that? Well, it's outside Joburg, it's the cradle of mankind, because South Africa has the largest collection of paleoanthropological findings in the world. And many, many atheists and scholars come to South Africa to study these things, okay? And of course, they use this to shore up the arguments for evolutionary theory, you know, as they're seeking to fill in the blanks in the tree of evolution. They get very excited when excavations will be done here in South Africa, okay? And in recent years, there was a tremendous amount of media and attention given to the cradle of mankind with Homo naledi and Sediba and all these kinds of things. Now, what do we make of that as Christians? Is this solid proof that evolutionary theory is the case? Well, I would argue, having been to the cradle of mankind a number of times and having been there with friends of mine, a good friend of mine, unfortunately, who passed away. She actually did her PhD at Wits under Lee Berger, the guy who's kind of spearheaded much of this recent work. And she actually worked on Sadiba. She was an expert on teeth. And so I was actually to go through the exhibits in which she, as a Christian scholar in this field, was pointing out issues to me that rarely, if ever, were mentioned in the public papers. Okay. But a lot of stuff is kind of toned down over all of that in recent years because they had to date these findings in these caves. And unfortunately for the evolutionists, they were hoping that these things would be dated to a much earlier period so that it could fill in some of the holes in the evolutionary tree. The problem with Naledi and Sadiba is that these things that they found outside Joburg are fairly recent. They're not 2 to 3 million years old, they're 200 to 300,000 years old. So rather than helping to solve the problems of evolution, they've created more problems. Of course, that's not being mentioned in the papers, and that's not going to get published in National Geographic, but that's the truth of the matter. But I would argue, when it comes to this question, as Christians, be careful not to get bogged down into the discussion over fossils and fossil records, okay? There are some discussions there worthy of having, and there are people who can engage on some of those things. But in my understanding of the debate as I've been following it, the debate really has moved, okay? It's shifted. Years ago, people would look at fossil records and try to reconcile things. But really, the debate has moved. And the reason why the debate has moved is because of the advances in science. Because the question we really want to ask is, whatever the nature and the relationship is of these hominid finds with one another and us, if there is a relationship, okay, you have to really ask, how did life come to be in the first place? Okay, it's a massive leap to show some physiological relationship or shared aspect of anatomy between two creatures and then just say, oh, therefore evolution. We now know, as a result of scientific developments, okay, that really allow us to peer down into the cells to see that there's a question that we need to ask ourselves first. And this is the question of the abiogenesis, the question of how life begins in the first instance. And if life begins in the first instance, what is the nature of that life? Okay, and how did that come about? Because if we can't answer that question, okay, then maybe the leaps that are being made elsewhere are illegitimate. And that's what I would think. So the debate, I reckon, has shifted from paleoanthropology to the question of abiogenesis and also information systems within biological structures. Okay, why? Because we found this thing called DNA, okay? This was discovered, as I understand, 1950s with two British scientists, Watson and Francis Crick. They got a Nobel Prize for it. Okay, what is the DNA? DNA is a biological information system of incredible complexity that governs the design of all living things, from the most basic life form to the most complex life form. This is significant because the immediate question is we can ask is, how did this begin? Where did this come from? If the most basic life form, single cell, has to have this system within it, where did it get it from? Because it starts with that. There's no time for it to evolve. It begins with that. It has to have that to begin with. Okay? That's how the most basic life forms begin. So they need these in them. So this is really where the debate is. It's really got, as my estimation, the debates in paleoanthropology are subservient to this debate in many respects, because whatever relationship you might point out to me between Naledi and Sadiba and, I don't know, some Neanderthal individual, and to just say, oh, therefore evolution, is just to fail to recognize what else is going on in scientific discussions. So let's look at our next slide as I drink my tea here.
So Simon, while you drink your tea, can I maybe just add that Dr. James Deur, if I understand, he's a molecular biologist that
That's
also
right.
does a lot of work on abiogenesis. And
yes.
And he's a Christian or a Messianic Jew that has a beautiful story of how he came to Christ. But he's an absolute I don't know, how can you How can you help me word my next sentence about James Deur and his work?
Well, he's one of the top 50 scientists in the world. He's written over 650 academic papers. Now, if you know anything about academics, I'm going to ask Mike, what do you think of 650 academic papers?
Better chance of me rising and walking under my own power than right now.
Yeah, he's off the charts smart and prolific. And so he's a man who really understands that. And he has helped, and he's not the first, there's many others who have been raising this issue and putting this primary and important question in front of these skeptics and saying, well, look, he understands molecular biology. And the question is, now we have to ask, that's how life begins at a molecular level. So we need some explanations here. The problem is when we look at our cells at a molecular level, we find that inside the cell, there's this information system, okay? DNA is an information system. That DNA is an information system is uncontroversial, okay? It's such an excellent information storage systems that now there are competitions, okay, at universities to try and see who can put the most information on DNA, how much information. So yeah, we got there, a bioengineer and geneticist at Harvard's Weiss Institute has successfully stored 5.5 petabits of data, around 700 terabytes on a single gram of DNA. Now, I'm not a tech geek, but for those of you who are, how much information is 700 terabytes? That's a lot, as I'm told by my brother who's an engineer. It's a tremendous amount. So we as human beings are putting information onto a biological structure. DNA is an information system that can carry information. And if there's an information system at biological level, you have to ask, where does that information system come from? Because information systems come from a mind. Only minds produce information systems. But if you're an atheist, you're going to have to ask, you're going to have to believe that this information system, which governs all life from the very beginning, came from where? Well, we're going to find out. Okay. This is really where the debate is. And so I encourage you, maybe what you can do, Ranier, is you can maybe post some recommended videos with James Deur, maybe starting off with his testimony and then some of his work, because you're right. He really does help people understand some of these things. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Okay. All right. So it's important. So how might we think about the importance of this? Well, why is it important? Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit about this concept of irreducible complexity. What do we mean by that? Well, this guy, Dr. Michael Behe, who I also encourage you to read his works and consider him, has done tremendous work on this issue of evolution, because he's put together an argument, and it makes a lot of sense in my estimation, that the problem that the biologists and the evolutionists face is the problem of irreducible complexity. Okay, what is that argument? Well, you can use an analogy to help you understand the argument. What do we have here? Let me pick on somebody else. So who else do we have in our team here? I picked on Yashel. Who's the bottom at the bottom there? Who's with our group here? Who have we not picked on? Brady?
I would say Niels.
Let's pick on Niels. Okay, Niels, can you put your mic on? Do you hear us? I don't know. Maybe he's making himself a cup of tea. Yes. Okay, we won't pick on Niels. We'll pick on.
Sorry, you can just. You're welcome to pick on Niels.
Okay, we're going to pick on Niels. Niels, what do we have on the left-hand side there?
Sorry, I don't see anything now.
Okay, do you guys see it?
Just.
You guys see the mouse trap or the rat trap?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so let's talk about that. That rat trap is an instrument that has a purpose. What's its purpose? What's purpose?
That's right.
That's right. Pretty simple, hey? So how many aspects of that device can you identify? What do you have there? Just kind of point out what's on that. You've got a base plate. Describe for me the other aspects of that device.
Spring.
Yeah. You've got a spring. Yeah, you've got a few things there. You've got a hook to put the bait on, the cheese on, something to hold that down. Yeah, trigger. There we go. There's a trigger there, yeah. And then there's the hammer. There's the piece that comes over that drills the rat and ends his existence. So it's a very simple tool, but it's got about 6 or 7 aspects to it. Now, if you take away one component of that thing, does it work?
No.
In order for that thing to function, all of those things have to be there at the same time. If not, what happens to the rat? Well, he gets away with it. Yeah, he gets away with it. He chews your wife's washing machine cables and causes havoc. Okay. So in order for that thing to function, all of that thing has to be working. It has to be there at the same time. Okay. All right. Now let's look at the other thing on the right-hand side there. What is that?
Outboard motor. Outboard.
Do you like to go fishing?
Yes.
Okay, I found a fisherman. I love fishing as well. Now, suppose you show up at Simon's house and I said, we're going to go fishing now. And you go, fine, we're going to go to the dam and I've got a boat. You see the boat and you look at the back of the boat there and you see a motor. But you look at my motor and you see that there's no prop on the motor. And I said to you, we're going fishing. What are you going to say to me?
We are not going anywhere.
We're not going anywhere. I said to him, okay, I put a prop on, and whilst I'm doing that, I'm just opening up the lid, and I lift the lid there, and inside the lid, you realize it's empty. What's going to happen?
Nothing.
Nothing. We aren't going fishing. But I said, look, I've got a motor there. So then I put a motor in there, and we look at it, and then you realize that there's no drive shaft between the engine and the prop. What's going to happen? We're staying at home. We're not going fishing, because in order for that motor to function, all of these aspects have to be there together in order for this thing to do what it's meant to do. You don't go fishing unless that whole thing is all working together, much like the mousetrap. Well, this analogy is used for us for examining biological structures and systems, because when we look at certain biological structures and systems, we realize that they are irreducibly complex, which means this poses a massive problem for evolutionary theory, because evolutionary theory says that over a long period of time, with incremental small changes, these things evolved. The problem is that how could that be the case then? Because right from the beginning, you need a functional structure that's working. And if it doesn't work, it's not like it's waiting for something else to show up. Remember, there's no intentionality here. You've got something that's dysfunctional. It's a problem in the cell. What, did the cell have something in it that was waiting for it to be shaped, to become? And what kind of things might those be? Well, Michael B. and scientists talk about it. This is the example they use. It's the bacteria flagellum. This is a thing that propels things around in water, and it's basically, it's like an outboard motor. It's fixed into a membrane. It has all the features of a motor in terms of the way it spins. It can spin in both different directions. It propels cells and things forward. And without these little critters, we will be dead. But could this thing have been built and kind of had the rotator thing just waiting there? And well, maybe, a few years from now, I'll get the whip-like tail, which is the propeller of this thing, and that'll suddenly attach itself conveniently. No, this thing's like an outboard motor. And if all those pieces are not there at the same time, you don't get life. Okay, this is why Michael B.'s argument is so powerful, because this is how life begins. And many aspects of our cells are like this. Like, for example, the cell membrane, immensely complex. okay? To let things in, let things out, the size of things, and it's extremely complex. Well, that's how life begins. And you don't get life with a half-formed or a partly formed cell membrane. That cells just die. Well, if life begins like this, there needs to be an explanation for it. And so I find that these arguments coming from the intelligent design community are very compelling. Now, I understand them at a kind of a layman level, so I wouldn't stand up and defend them in an academic setting, but they've persuaded me that it's very reasonable to believe that the design we see in nature comes from an intelligent mind. Now, of course, there are Christians out there who have PhDs in this field, and we need to encourage them to get into the arena and to make their arguments because they've got the academic credentials. We leave that to them. But man, these things to me are fascinating, interesting, and very compelling. This makes a lot of sense, okay? Not only does it make sense to me, some of the confessions of the atheists are rather revealing. Yeah, we have Francis Crick. Francis Crick was one of the two chaps who got a Nobel Prize for discovering DNA. Now, these guys are atheists. They themselves were so overwhelmed by the complexity of this biological structure that they, on their evolutionary worldview foundation, said, look, this thing's not forming here on this planet. This is too complex. And if this is how life begins, we've got a problem here. So what did they posit? Well, they posited some theories, one of which was directed panspermia. What does he mean by that? This is the intentional spreading of the seeds of life to other planets by an advanced extraterrestrial civilization, or of the intentional spreading of the seeds of life from Earth to other planets by humans. So here's the atheists who, through their own scientific investigations, are saying that the aliens did it. This isn't some kooks. These aren't people who are just, those, wild-eyed Baptist people living in the mountains at their stupid Bible college. This is the guy who got the Nobel Prize for discovering the DNA. He himself was so overwhelmed by this design that this is a theory that he proposed, and many people take it very seriously. In fact, Richard Dawkins makes mention of this. Well, of course, I would agree. This complexity begs explaining. Most likely it could have come from an intelligence. And of course, if you're going to grant aliens, fair enough, but I'm quite comfortable with Jesus as a hypothesis then. I'm quite comfortable with theism as an alternative explanation. And of course, here's the problem, as Mike would point out then, if the aliens did it, the problem with that is that you're going to ask, well, where did the design and the aliens come from? And you end up with an infinite regress problem. So it just kicks the can down the road, never answers the question. Okay. So.
Can I say something?
Yes.
So the reason that question will come up for the aliens is because they would be material and they would have physical complexity and biological complexity that would need explaining. But because God is immaterial and doesn't have that kind of biological complexity, the question doesn't arise for him.
All right. So that's quite telling to see what these skeptics are saying about this thing now. Okay. So we've talked about this. It just pushes the problem back one step. And so I do think that Ranier is right. The question of abiogenesis, and I agree with him, is where the debate really is. And there are many people you can listen to. I highly recommend Dr. James Deur because of his expertise in this field. And the question of how do you get life from non-life? It's a fair question. If prior to life in the world, the environment was one of non-life, then I take it that by definition, it's a sterile environment. So then the question is, how do you get life from a sterile environment? Doesn't it seem to violate the very laws of sterilization that engineers who design sterilization equipment all just assume? Yeah, well, so this is when I've spoken to atheists. It's interesting. I remember doing some evangelism, and we were in America actually with Mike, and we were speaking to some atheists, and they said to me, you Christians, you believe in supernatural things, and that's kind of absurd. You believe in a resurrection, and, I said to him, yeah, well, from your position as a naturalist, these things do make no sense to you. But from my position, these things make sense because I have an agent in here to explain it. So we don't just believe in the resurrection, it just kind of happened. There's an agent behind it. I said to him, but I mean, you shouldn't feel too bad about it because you yourself have your own versions of the miraculous. So then the skeptic said, well, what do you mean by that? I said to him, well, if you're an atheist, you have to believe that the universe came from nothing. Because that's what you said. I said to him, you also have to believe that life comes from non-life. You have to believe that information systems can just materialize out of nowhere. I said to him, those are your miracles. In my case, in my worldview, I have a causal agent to explain that. It's called God. But that's your miracle. I mean, how do you get life from non-life? How do you get an information system from mindless stuff? What is there within physics and chemistry to produce an information system? That's your miracle. So, welcome to the supernatural. So we mustn't be afraid to challenge these guys because they are stuck with us now, but we have to understand their worldview and something of them to ask them some questions, so we can press them with some of these questions. Okay. So to try and help and give you some sense of this, how I might discuss this with people. If you were to stand on a beach and you saw the stuff on the beach there, Anthony loves Lisa, you're not going to think to yourself, gee whiz, those waves are amazing. Look at what those waves just did. No, you're going to know there's intentionality there. There's a human mind behind that because information comes from a human mind. Just like if you were driving through the hills of Ireland and you saw that on the hill, you're not going to go, wow, what an amazing thunderstorm that just passed by. When you see information, then you know that there's a mind behind it. When we're doing other sciences, forensics and cryptology or archaeology, and in the case of archaeology, you're digging in Middle East and around Nineveh and you find a clay tablet and you see these things, you know that isn't just a pattern from nature, that is a pattern from a mind. That's an information system, and you correctly make an inference, oh, there must have been people here communicating. Well, if you have an information system and can identify that in the case of a clay tablet, and yet we have an information system in biological structures, which makes human information systems look rather dumb, why do you make an inconsistent inference then? In the one case, you say, oh, yeah, there's a mind behind that. But in this case, no. Well, what's your basis for saying no in the second case? It's an inconsistent inference. And we need to hold people accountable to that. So every instance of design implies a designer. The universe is an instance of design. Therefore, there is a designer of the universe. And that's a good summary and syllogism of the design argument. Okay. So we've looked at kinds of arguments, philosophical arguments, Kalam's argument. We looked at some design arguments from fine-tuning all the way through to your arguments related to information systems and biological structures and irreducible complexity. You can go and think through these things. But in addition to all of this, we don't just live in a physical universe. We also live in a universe in which it's moral. All right, Rainier, we've gone for quite long now. Do we want to just take a short break with everybody?
Simon, that would be absolutely perfect. Could we say maybe let's make it a good 15-minute break, and then can they in the break think of some questions so that when we come back, then we can start with some questions. So let's see. So then
just after one.
Yeah, so let's start then again 10 past 1, if that is fine.
Okay, we'll chat then.
All right, perfect. See you guys now. Enjoy the break.
Okay. No.
As I swear, die vloer is julle sin.
Okay, so we're going to move on now to our third argument and our concluding argument. As I said to you, there are many arguments for the existence of God. We're going to conclude here on the moral argument for the existence of God. And so just to put a few preliminary concepts and ideas on the table, and statements. Physics and chemistry do not give you morality. Okay, physics and chemistry get you behavior. Behavior tells us what is. John runs every morning, for example, is behavior. John assaults old people is behavior as well. But notice there's a distinction between John running and John assaulting people. Okay, because we don't have a problem with John running in the morning, but we have a problem with John assaulting people. Well, why? Why do we have a problem with that? With respect to biology, these are just two different activities. These are just two different behaviors. Yet when we assess these behaviors, we're okay with the one, but we're definitely not okay with the other one. Where is the I'm definitely not okay with John come from? And so morality in some sense is prescriptive. It's because behind that concern of John assaulting a woman lies this notion that we want John not to do that, that he ought not do that. Well, where does that ought not come from? Okay, so it just gives you some ideas on it. So let's consider this video. We'll just watch this video here. Here we have a National Geographic video of chronicling basically the behavior of chimpanzees somewhere in Africa, where these chimpanzees have killed another chimpanzee and are busy cannibalizing it. And the reason why this kind of stuff from National Geographic is deceptive is because they layer that footage with all of this emotional music in the background, and then they've got a burial for these chimps, you know. Well, chimps don't bury each other, and chimps don't care about the chimpanzee or the behavior. They are just doing what chimpanzees do, and sometimes chimpanzees eat one another. Well, we have no problem when chimps behave like that. We don't round up chimpanzees who've been behaving badly and say, you ought not do that, you naughty chimpanzee. But I can rest assured you, if you come to my house and start attempting to eat my children, then there's going to be some problems here. You ought not cannibalize my children. Well, if we're just trousered apes, if we're just sophisticated chimps, then it seems like, on what basis can we say that certain behavior is legitimate and illegitimate in an objective sense? Because if we just got behavior, well, then that's just different kinds of behavior. But as Christians, we say, no, it's not just behavior. There's another layer to this. There's another dimension to this, and this is the moral dimension. There are certain laws, prescriptive laws, that apply to human beings and not to primates. Okay, so that's important for us to get some sense of this. Okay, now, why is this important? Because if you're an atheist, for example, and you believe in a mechanistic view of the universe, then all you have is physics and chemistry, and then what follows from that is a worldview which is committed to some of these ideas. Let's take this quote here. Let's read through this quote. During the minute that it takes me to compose the sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive, and many others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are slowly being devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. It must be so. If there ever is a time of plenty, this very fact will automatically lead to an increase in the population until the natural state of starvation and misery is restored. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces of genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, others are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is a bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. This comes from Richard Dawkins. And he's been consistent with his atheistic convictions. If we are in a universe and there is no God, then this is all that you got going on. And he's right. And if that's the case, then what is the basis for our laws by which we govern society? We talk about setting precedent and legal systems and putting people in jail. What are we doing putting people in jail? Who are we to put people in jail? That's just the way they behave. Some men help people across the street. Some men rape women. That's just one kind of behavior. Since when does raping, since when is that evil? Now, they understand this and the atheists say this, okay? Of course, they don't live like this, okay? And so then they have to then come along and come up with some kind of argument for what they think morality is. But many of them, and this isn't the only ones, we're going to look at a few other people now, this is just what comes. This is just part of the commitments of an atheistic worldview for many atheists. Not all atheists hold to this view, and I would think that they're inconsistent with their own metaphysics at some level, but many of them and the majority of them do, okay? That's why, for example, atheists like this J.L. Mackie, very telling, just the title of his book, Ethics. What is ethics? Well, it's inventing right and wrong. There is no objective law out there beyond mankind. We just invent it. This is the kind of ethical theory which is taught pretty much everywhere at most universities in the West, that ethics is just conventional. Society decides what's right and wrong. So what's right? Whatever we decide. If we decide a couple of years' time that we want these laws, well, then those will be right. Why? Because we decide them. We invent it. In a Christian worldview, we definitely don't invent ethics. Our ethics comes from the kinds of beings we are, and the kinds of being we are was determined by God. And according to the laws that God created us, it also comes with this dimension of morality. And so he is ultimately the foundation for the laws by which human beings ought to live. Okay, let's take another thing. I'm not picking on Richard Dawkins all the time. Here's another very famous atheist, Michael Ruse. He's written 40 or 50 books and well-known. Let's see what he says. He says, morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says love thy neighbor as yourself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Now, because as Christians, we don't want to put words in the mouth of others, and we don't want to straw man their position. So it's important for you to have some knowledge of the atheists and what they've said, so that when, for example, you're speaking to people who are committed to atheism or agnosticism, whatever, and they try to say, well, I don't think that, you can say, well, hang on a sec. That might well be the case, though, but that's not what a lot of serious atheists thinks. And then you can refer them to these serious atheists. These are the atheists who write the books. I said to them, you might not think that, but that's not what serious atheists. I mean, J.L. Mackie was a pretty serious atheist. Michael Ruse is a pretty serious atheist. And I think both of them are far more competent than Richard Dawkins. And there's many others. And many others have said precisely what Michael Ruse is saying here. So that's what comes with it. If you live in a world governed by the forces of physics and chemistry, then Friedrich Nietzsche was right. Okay. Now, how might we go about doing the moral argument for the existence of God? There's been various ways that it's been formulated over the years, and I'm actually glad that Mike's here, because the way that some people had structured it, I'd never really found really compelling. But in my discussions with Mike over the years, he had shown me that the way to formulate the argument for morality is along the lines of values. Okay, and that's important because valuing something is something that people do. Okay, and of course, our values are tied to our morality. Okay, so if human beings have values, someone values them. Okay. People aren't valuable just because I say so. Okay, if that were the case, though, then when we don't say so, then people aren't valued. So when the Germans said the Jews aren't valuable, then you can then justifiably go and gas them. Okay, just hang on a sec. Could you tell these boys? I just told them. Kick them out. Sorry, my boys here are just misbehaving now. Kai, Yanis, I just told both of you. Sorry then. My
So
voice
was
didn't
that
work.
was that something to do with values that you just
Yes,
did
there's
now?
something to do with values. Yes, Daddy had some values to try and lay out there. Yes. Yeah, they're being a little bit rowdy here. So I just told them to just go to the back of the house and play there. All right. So here we have human beings have value. Therefore, somebody values them. But the human being's value is not something that's come from other human beings. Because of course, if those human beings decide not to value somebody, then there's no value there. You know, we don't value the Jews, so they're not valuable. So we can do whatever we want to them. We do value the Jews. So notice this then. So are Jews valuable because you say so? Think about that. Think about what a monstrous idea that is. That's where we are in a lot of our contemporary ethics. Is value something that's bestowed. Well, thank you very much for valuing me. I really appreciate it. I hope that you'll continue to value me for the next 24 hours. You know, there's a monstrous idea if ever there was one. Because our value doesn't come from other human beings. It ultimately comes from God. And we see this, you can tie this back into the laws of, you know, murder, for example. God doesn't have a problem with you if you slit a sheep's throat this evening and have a braai after we watch the Springboks play against Wales and we win. But God has a serious problem if you slit another human being's throat and start to braai that human being. Okay? Because sheep and human beings are not of the same value. You're not just another animal out there. You're a different kind of thing altogether. And evolutionary theory would deny that. According to the evolutionists, you are just a sophisticated trousered ape. Okay. Right. So it's important that we understand some of this then. So humans have value even when no humans value them. Therefore, someone values them even when no human values them. That's someone we take to be God. I think that this is a formulation of the argument along the lines, I think comes from Aquinas, eh? Or is this your argument?
I mean, well, I didn't invent it, but
yeah. But a number of people frame like this. I think Aquinas has got a version of it as well along the lines.
Sounds like something he was.
Yeah. Okay. So this is how we've got it then. Okay. So this is basically the moral argument then. If human beings have values, are those values conferred on them by other human beings? If they're not and they're valuable, where does that value come from? Well, the periodic table doesn't value things. The Eno experiment doesn't care about you. Only people value things. And if we've established that human beings aren't the ones conferring the value, then your human value must come from another being, another person, and we take that to be God. So there's the way. Now, since Mike is here, I want to ask him if he can maybe say some more about this argument and unpack it. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to ask them. Mike, what else do you have to say for us then?
Yeah, well, so there's this argument, which I think is a good one. Because when we think about all the things that have value, we can't, or at least I can't, think of anything that I would acknowledge has value without at least being able to point to someone who values it. In fact, it seems to me that's just part of what it means for something to have value, is that it's valued. You might say, no, wait a minute. For something to have value isn't for someone to value it, it's for it to be the case that someone ought to value it. Maybe, you know, someone who has knowledge of all the relevant facts or something like that. But it seems to me that gets things backwards. It's not that some particular thing is valuable because someone ought to value it. It goes the other way. Someone ought to value it because it's valuable, because it has value. So if it turns out that things having value indicates that they are valued by someone, then we have to ask, is the value of things dependent on human beings valuing them? Or are there at least some things that have value even if every human being didn't value them? And if we think that's true, then their value has to come from someone else valuing them, someone who transcends human beings. And as Simon said, that's someone we call God. And you could get into exactly why it needs to be God who is the locus of value, but that may take us a bit far afield.
Yeah.
Also, though, there's another argument you could give here that connects to an earlier argument that Simon mentioned having to do with the nature of information. Because one of the things that we know when we consider the nature of moral rules, moral obligations, that it's wrong to murder, it's wrong to steal, it's good to be generous, these sorts of things. Well, what are they? They're information about how human beings ought to behave. And if information can only come from a mind, then this sort of information about how we ought to behave can only come from a mind as well.
Okay.
And yet it doesn't come from a human mind precisely because morality, at least in many contexts, transcends human beings. And therefore it has to come from a mind that transcends human beings as well.
So it's important when it comes to this discussing morality and the argument for God for morality, that we understand some of the metaphysical commitments or the foundational commitments of atheists and skeptics.
Sorry, Simon, can you just explain metaphysics, please?
Yeah, so metaphysics is a study of the nature of reality. And so for an atheist, when you ask him what his metaphysics is, it's what does he think the nature of reality is like? So for him, the nature of reality is that all there is the physical. All there is physics and chemistry to this universe. And of course, we would take issue with that because we think that whilst there is physics and chemistry, there's more to the universe than just that. Okay. So, but many atheists are consistent with the metaphysics. They actually believe that's all we have. And so that's why Michael Ruse will say, if this is what the universe is composed of and we're a part of that universe, then ethics is illusory. Whatever we say about ethics, it's not objectively true. There is no right and wrong ultimately. There is no good and evil. There's just physics and chemistry, and you're a part of that. You're just a machine in motion, okay? And you're just a sophisticated Eno experiment, okay? With just more complex than dropping a tablet into a glass of water, but you're basically just fizzing away. And chemistry and physics don't care. They just happen. You're just happening. Now, we talk about ethics, but it's really a description of behaviorism, okay? But there is no really objective right and wrong. And other atheists have said this. I mean, Friedrich Nietzsche, not only did he say this, he understood the implications of this, that if there is no God, then anything is permissible, okay? Ultimately, and whoever has the power and whoever would have the strength of character to determine the future should just get out there and exercise that power and establish society as he would see fit based upon the principles of him and his friends. And that's what we've got. Ethics just becomes a power game. Unfortunately, there is no objective standard outside of mankind because we basically invent the ethics we want. Okay. Now, thankfully, Christianity is true and we're not stuck in that universe. And that ultimately, however bad it gets, there is an ultimate lawgiver and he will bring into existence and he will make manifest righteousness and truth and redemption and creation, not just the physical creation and restoration of that, but also the moral component as well. Okay, it's a very important dimension to reality as Christians, and we need to talk about it and understand to some extent the commitments of others with other worldviews. Okay, because I think that this is a way to critique their worldview, because the worldview falls short by failing to offer a reasonable explanation for this dimension of reality. That human beings are valuable and that we don't just think that the same as parrots and donkeys and, you know, guinea pigs. And if you treat them in the same way, there's a problem with you, okay? A fundamental problem with you, that if you treat my children like you treat your pet, there's a problem with you, okay? So this is a good argument. It's a frame the moral argument. There's, like I said to you, there are many different varieties of moral arguments out there. I like the way this is framed. I've learned this from Marcus to do it along values, because we all value something. And then we can ask, well, we value human beings. Well, are they valuable because I said so? Because you said so? because we said so? If we don't say so, would they not make them valuable? So you can point out the problem there. And you said, well, if we agree that human beings have value, where does that value came from? We've established it can't come from us, so then it must come from some other being, and that person is God. That's why we have these commandments in the Old Testament. Thou shalt not murder, because God has said these kinds of creatures, okay, are valuable, and if you do this to them, if you murder them, you're in trouble with me. Okay, so that's really cool. These are the arguments. So put together then, we have a cumulative case here. We can put together multiple arguments, both to ourselves and to those skeptics, and say, well, there's many good reasons and arguments for thinking that God exists. And we've looked at a few of them this morning: philosophy and science, morality, and also history. Now, we're not going to dive into history now because we've been going for a few hours here now, but Karnu covered a lot of that now, but we can put this all together. Some people prefer to put an emphasis in some areas. Some people like the historical stuff. They love the archaeology and the Bible stuff. I love that stuff as well. Some people love the God and science debate. Some people really enjoy the design arguments. I really like those. I find them a little bit more intuitive to me and easier to articulate to people. I have some understanding of the philosophical arguments and the morality arguments, although they're a little bit more abstract to me. But for many people, those have been the most persuasive arguments. For example, C.S. Lewis was moved from an atheist to Christianity in some sense, if I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong there, Mike, but because of his thinking about the moral dimension of the universe. Okay, so it was the moral argument that moved C.S. Lewis towards faith. I've know of people who've been moved towards theism as a result of philosophical arguments. One of them is a very smart guy. He's Catholic, but he's brilliant. Is Edward Fazer. He was just looking at the Thomistic arguments and as an atheist and realized these arguments are sound. I've got a problem. God must exist, and if God exists, and if it's the God of the Bible, which he was sure there was that God, then he was going to have to do something. So here we see that even if you didn't have any arguments out there and your convictions of God were much more subjective, that's fine. Okay, it doesn't invalidate your faith or make you any less of a person. Okay, but there are many compelling arguments out there for the existence of God. And it's good for you to think about them and think through them. And you might agree with them. And then if you do, and you're happy with that, you can then make them a part of your witness. Because when you do bump into people and you have the privilege of sharing the gospel with them, you do bump into people who've got questions. And you, like I said, as the scripture says, always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that was within you. So now you can add to your Christian journey with the Lord some new material, some new truths to bring to the table to help you be more effective at communicating the gospel in our age.
Simon,
right?
If I know we've been going on a long time, and if I can maybe ask you and Mike, if you could maybe, if you're willing, if you could play the skeptic, and Mike could maybe play the believer. Just to interact maybe with us on the just for a couple of minutes, maybe, or minute or two, just on the morality argument, just to lock in that idea and to see how it might play out.
Okay, so I'm gonna be the atheist and the skeptic, and Mike is gonna be the believer.
Yes, please.
Okay. So if God exists, why do you look like you do? How about that?
Well, he has to make it fair for everyone else.
All right. Yeah. Okay, so let me it's kind of difficult for me because I've been studying so long. It's difficult for me to role play the atheist and that. But let me try and do this again. I know we've done this with students before. My wife and I will sometimes go to a student camp, and they don't know that we're Christians, and we kind of come in and pretend we're atheists to kind of help people understand it. So let me think of how I would do this then. Let me try and level an objection to God. Well, Mike, this morality thing, yeah, I don't agree with those arguments. It's pretty clear from evolutionary theory, if you look at evolutionary psychology, that basically evolution, whilst it is just behavior, these behaviors are there and become what they are as a result of the drive of evolutionary forces, that is survival of the fittest. And so it's not the case that we're just going to suddenly decide that Jews are not valuable. We know that in a herd, that the herd itself, the benefits of the herd is not to just kill everybody, you know. And so I can explain what you think I can't explain on the basis of evolutionary psychology. That is that our behaviors are conditioned by these evolutionary forces, and that we don't just murder one another because it's not good for the survival of the fittest.
So do those explanations apply to non-human animals as well?
Yeah, so that's also, you see the same behavior in other beings, and we're just another species behaving, and so that behavior, you know, lions might kill other lions, but they don't just kill all their own, you know. They because, you know, the herd, part of the survival of the fittest is you know,
if a lion did eat its own, would it be evil? Should we try that lion for murder?
No.
But if I were to eat your children, I would be evil.
Yes, you certainly would be evil. Yeah, but eating my children is not in the best interest of the herd.
So your children are more valuable than the lion.
Well, not for the lion. I mean, the lion values his own cubs. He's just going to kill the other cubs. But yeah.
Yeah. So then, what complaint do you have against the lion if the lion were to eat your children?
I don't really have a complaint against the lion. I might have a complaint against you.
What if I said I valued the lion more than your children? That might be mean, but is that immoral?
Yeah, in some sense it's immoral because it doesn't help our human herd.
What's the difference between the lion and the human that makes the one okay to eat other animals, but if humans start eating humans, that's bad?
It's bad for my culture because you're just imposing your values from that, and in my culture.
What if you were in a different culture that proved it?
Well, we'll just do whatever that culture decided, and if that culture.
So if you were back in the apartheid era, when that culture was perfectly okay with all sorts of brutality against the majority of the.
I think I've got a coffee appointment later this afternoon. Yeah, you see, the problem, Rainier, is it's difficult because I'm with Mike here, and I'm not going to last long. He's going to. This is so I can.
Well, so maybe it would be more helpful if there are questions in particular that could help me to see which aspects were unclear, then I can try to make them more clear.
Yeah. So,
or what I'm supposed to do at some stage is write this up somewhere. Maybe this will motivate me to do that.
Yeah.
And then you guys can look at it.
The difficulty with role playing an atheist is I know where Mike is coming from, and I kind of know what the atheist is, and so I end up doing what atheists don't do. Is I'm laying out for him my fundamental foundations, and he says, okay, if those are them, then here's a scenario. And then as an atheist, I'm going, I'll never accept that. But then he's saying, well, you've just said that that's what you want. And so then it's game over. I'm done. So what we need to learn as Christians is don't for a moment think that there's tremendous merit to some of these systems there. And, you know, it's another worldview which we could never bottom out. No, it's not. It's actually quite simple. There are some big ideas and commitments that they have. And all you got to do is learn what those are and hold them to it consistently. And doesn't take much for it to all the house of cards to come crashing down. you know.
I saw maybe Dirk and Nelis had a question, but I just saw they disappeared. But what I enjoyed about your interaction is, that is what we need to see. In a sense, we need to experience how a good line of questioning, keeping the person responsible for what he said in the first place, and then taking it objectively away, in a sense. I don't know if I'm using the right English word at the moment, but taking it out of a personal scenario to make a point, and then bring that objective or that thing that is outside of your immediate self, and then bring that standard back to your immediate self, to show how it is not consistent, and how Christianity is consistent.
Yeah. So how you might have an objection from a skeptic might be, suppose we're discussing this, then inevitably on a popular level, it usually ends up going along those lines. Well, what about all of those Christians out there what about the Crusades? And what about those preachers over there robbing everybody?
Well, that's why we need to vote them out of Parliament. So.
Yes. So that's typically where it's going to end up then, It's going to go that line, or often to go, well, and if your God is so good and loving, then why does he allow evil to happen? If he's so evident to you, why is it we don't see him intervening in this apparently horrible, evil world, saving, little children from, stage 4 pneumoblastoma? Where is your God? If he's so clear to you, I don't see him. What I see around me is a world in which there's carnage. And much of it is caused by religion. Religion is as what Sam Harris says, what he says, it's and Richard Dawkins, his contemporary atheists, they say, religion is the source of much of the problems and evil and misery in the world. And so it's kind of like a sickness that people have, religion, and we need to get rid of religion. So what would you say to that, Mike?
Well, communist atheism was responsible for a lot more death and war than religion. But I also don't want to carry the water for religion. I think the vast majority of religions are false. And if you found anyone acting in accordance with the teaching of Jesus, you wouldn't find this occurring. So Jesus is the one to whom I would, or with whom I would align myself, precisely because he is the exception in all of history. The people who act like him don't act that way. Everyone else acts that way if you put them in the right circumstances, except the people who have Jesus.
So what would you say? What would you say to Christian nations who have been guilty of colonialist oppression?
It's precisely in the points where they depart from the character of Christ that they've been guilty of those things. To the extent that they're following Christ, they are putting away their swords, not confusing cultural trappings for the gospel, and doing what Paul did, preaching Christ crucified and him only, and they leave the rest of it to individual preferences. But when you try to baptize a culture and say, no, this culture is the right culture, and we're going to Christian it, we're going to civilize the barbarians. It's not our job to civilize the barbarians, whoever they may be. We are the barbarians, and we need Jesus to civilize us all. And people who actually read the New Testament, that's the message they bring to people, and that's the message that changes the world.
Yeah.
So perfect. And maybe if I can transition and maybe just ask Lumay, because she's actually a student at Potchefstroom, and then Dirk, that has a bit more of wisdom and has lived a bit longer than I have. Maybe if they have any questions or have interacted with something that they have maybe a question about, that we can quickly use these two beautiful brains to help us in this process.
Ek dink nie ek het nou 'n spesifieke vraag nie. Ek dink net mens gaan, hoe kan ek sê, al die tools in jou toolbox moet insit en weet wanneer om dit te gebruik. Met wie en ook wat ek nou ook gedink het is, ek dink mens moet die Heilige Gees vertrou vir wanneer mens die argument moet voer en wanneer nie. Wanneer dit skade gaan maak en wanneer dit tot voordeel van die ander persoon se geloof gaan wees. So
No, I would concur with what you're saying, and it's good for you as a young person to see that, you know, the danger of teaching apologetics to people is like giving a child a hammer, and when you give a child a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail, and people aren't nails. Okay, so you've got to be careful of hammering people with apologetics. There is some wisdom in knowing when to deploy these arguments and knowing when to not deploy them. Not everybody is going to be open for a conversation for all kinds of reasons, because sin does terrible things to people. Sometimes you're not going to need to give people an argument. You're going to need to give them some love. You're going to need to express a love towards them. And the occasion might then present itself so that you can have the conversations. Very often that's how it works. First of all, people want to see that you love them, and then they might then ask the question. But it's not always like that. Sometimes people come out guns blazing, and you might have to give a reason for the hope that is within you, and it might be a contentious environment. In fact, we see this modeled in the New Testament, that Paul and many of the other early Christians didn't really concern themselves with how the audience may respond, because you can't be responsible for how people respond. All you can be is responsible for preparing yourself to be a good ambassador to represent Christ. So, and then the reactions can be from people converting to Christ, which is what we see in the gospel, in the Acts, to people saying, well, we want to hear you again on this, to people getting irritated with them, to people being apathetic and ignoring them, to people flogging and trying to kill them. So you had all of those responses, and we live in a world which is no different. There are many Christians living in countries now where they might be forced to speak the gospel, and at the end of that conversation, that's the last day on the face of this planet. They get killed, they get martyred. That's a reality. Unfortunately, in South Africa, we are not a country that doesn't have that kind of stuff going on. But certainly, if you in our country today start speaking up and preaching the gospel to people, you can also have all kinds of reaction. You can have people who respond to the gospel and are thankful that they meet Jesus, and that's a beautiful thing to see. You get people who go, well, I want to hear you again. I want more of a conversation, and you need to be prepared to walk that journey with them. You have people who insult you and hate you for doing it. Okay, that's very revealing of their worldview, that they're so insecure that they would react that way. But that's also happens, and you're going to get people who are hostile towards you, downright hostile. Okay, and for some of our brothers and sisters in persecuted countries, preaching the gospel isn't just hard; it's a deadly enterprise. You do that in the wrong environment, it's not just going to cost you, your marriage, and that it's going to cost you your life. But if it's true, okay, and Jesus is who he claims to be, and God is who he's claimed to be, then we put truth and Jesus above all things, including our lives, or we ought to. Okay, now it's easy to say that. It's one thing to live that life, but many Christians have lived that life, and we need to know our church history as well, because if you read church history, it's of great encouragement. In fact, one of the things I can commend to you and your church is to, when you get a chance, is to have a screening of the movie Tortured for Christ by Richard Wurmbrand. I know the book is brilliant. I encourage all young people to read the book, but they've made an excellent movie on and we showed it to our students here. And it's extraordinary to see the life and testimony of Christians who stood up in the face of some hardcore atheism and loved these people who basically would kill them. It's a very convicting testimony.
Could you just repeat that again, please?
The movie is called Tortured for Christ, okay. And I'll send you a link to that as well, which you can then maybe have a screening of that for your church and for others. It will be of great encouragement to them. It's a tough watch because, man, I tell you what, it makes you take a serious look at your Christian life, and it really puts things into perspective. So, but that's good. That's good for us to be confronted with that.
Good, Simon. I think we should maybe end on this note. I think everyone's brains are fried. The fire hydrant syndrome that you warned us at the beginning. I just want to say again, thank you to Rasha, Christie, to you and Mike. Mike, thank you for helping us in and through this process. And I know that we will be growing more in Christ as we are able to. As we journey together in seeking Him in what He has made known to us. So in that way, we will be able to have a good testimony towards God. So, Mike, can I ask you to end for us in prayer? And then we can call it a day. So everyone can log off. Simon, if I can just have a couple of more minutes of your time, if that is possible, after everyone has logged off. And okay, let us pray.
Okay. Lord God, we thank you for technology that allows us to have these kind of conversations despite our physical distance. We thank you that you have saved us, but that you've not simply asked us to take you at your word without providing us evidence, without showing us that you are trustworthy. We thank you that though you ask us to make it through this life, you took on human nature and jumped in the world with us and took on more suffering than any one of us could ever imagine. We thank you that after having done that, you proved that in fact that is what you had done by rising from the dead, and that you've left us all of these resources to know that when our religious affections aren't quite as what we'd like them to be, we can nevertheless know that you are there and you are not silent, even if we don't always hear what you might be telling us. We thank you that we have the scriptures so accessible to us today. We ask your favor upon all those who might struggle to have access to the scriptures, to know the good news that you have redeemed the world and are reconciling the world to yourself. We ask that you would give us opportunities to spread that good news, that you would help us to be bold in doing so, that we wouldn't be afraid of the skepticism and the cynicism that surrounds us today, that we would know that we can be people of the cross, because it didn't end there, that you conquered the cross by conquering the grave. Help to give us confidence, help to keep us mindful of all you've done for us, and help to enable us to love each other as we ought. We ask all these things in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Baie dankie.
Okay, take care. Have a good weekend.
Baie dankie. Hoi.
I think your sound is off there. You must just check your sound. You're on mute.
Ja, sorry. Thank you. Okay, julle. Dankie vir julle opoffering. En dan gesels ons dan nou gou weer. Sien ons mekaar Dinsdag aand. En lekker naweek verder. Bye bye.